Everyone hates fanboys.
Hello.
Even fanboys do. Just, they hate fanboys of other things. In the gaming sphere, fanboys are about as common as forks in a kitchen, with the difference being that forks can be actually used for something. Now, everyone is capable of becoming a fanboy if they lack the self-awareness not to be one. Sometimes, it's not even the fault of an individual when they become a fanboy, as entire communities can fanboyify slowly through just their passion for the games they like turning into the dismissal of things that are different, in a way that no individual fanboy is really responsible for the change. Nostalgia is often one of the biggest causes of fanboyism, and it has to be, in terms of your ability to critique things, equivalent to getting kicked in the face by a horse on a weekly basis. If you are a professional game reviewer, a low bar, to be fair, nostalgia can seriously mess with your interpretation of a game. So, today I'd like to go through some of the general things that fanboys do for fun, how they structure their arguments to make one game look artificially better or worse, some of the logical fallacies they use to get their way, and other similar stuff. I'll explain how they do it, and maybe even debunk a few of them for your viewing pleasure. And remember, a fan is not a fanboy, and we're only talking about fanboys here. First of all, I'd like to go over a very specific fanboy way of comparing games. Let's take two games as an example, Mario Galaxy and Mario Sunshine. Now, in my opinion, one of these games is one of the best 3D platformers of the 2000s, and the other is Mario Sunshine. But that aside, here's how the trick works. Let's say I'm a fan of the Galaxy games, which I sort of am, and that I really hate Sunshine, which I don't. How would I make Galaxy look good, while I make Sunshine look bad? Well, kinda like this. Mario Galaxy was a real breakthrough in terms of 3D platformers. It properly figured out how to lead players from location to locations, and knew how not to waste the player's time. The annoying flood mechanics were replaced with a much better corrective spin jump, and the health system was streamlined so the player was always on their toes. The level count was also drastically increased, where instead of dragging you on and on with random extra things to do in the same level you've been in 7 times already, and then forcing you to go around and search for blue coins just to make the game a little bit longer, Mario Galaxy instead lets you just play through way more unique galaxies with varied themes as opposed to just having the same island theme. And once you collect every single star, well, just play the game again as Luigi so you can test out your endgame skills and knowledge with the new, differently controlling characters on many of the earlier levels that you've already beaten. Much better than searching for boring blue coins. So far, I've done maybe a few things you have or maybe haven't noticed, and to properly make what I'm saying make sense, I'll also need to show you the inverse of what I just said now. Mario Galaxy was a step back from Sunshine. The vast, sprawling, complex levels were replaced with a series of linear platforming challenges with very loose theming. Flood's corrective ability was replaced with the dreaded Wiimote waggle, limiting the vertical movement Mario once had. The health was also reduced, giving the player an extra artificial level of difficulty beyond the platforming in a 3D platformer. There were more levels, sure, but you had way less to do and explore in each of them. And while they were all relatively varied, all of them were just kinda generic space levels. And past a few key levels, I mean, it's really hard to pick your favorites. Who remembers Bowser's Star Reactor? Ha! This is gameplay of Bowser's Dark Matter Plant instead. I gotcha, they're all basically the same sometimes. Compare that with Corona Mountain, a properly unique final level that stands out from everything else in the game. Quality over quantity, if you'd will. And the blue coins that people complain about, they're optional. Is a challenge too hard for you? Well, you could instead adventure around collecting for them. None of that play the entire game again with worse controls for the true ending bullshit. I mean, this isn't Ghosts and Goblins, though actually Galaxy's true ending hits about as hard as the NES Ghosts and Goblins, to be honest. Now, I'm assuming that by this point, most of you can see what I mean, but in case you can't, here's the point of this. The first paragraph compares Galaxy to Sunshine in a very specific way. It establishes Galaxy as this incredible game compared to Sunshine. This is partially already feeding off of the natural idea that newer is better because it's an evolution of the previous work, and then the rest of the paragraph basically takes that established idea as a fact to claim that these differences make Sunshine inferior. The second paragraph does the same, but in reverse, claiming it was a step back, and that every single change was a change for the worse. While reading these two paragraphs, you may have found something you agree with, disagree with, maybe there's even something you liked in both of them. Maybe you really did dislike the blue coins, or maybe you like them. Maybe you think the blue coins aren't a bad idea by themselves, but there were just way too many of them. Maybe you split on the idea. Maybe you like Flood and the spin jump. Maybe you dislike both of those. Maybe you're annoyed it didn't mention some things, like how Sunshine is technically fully linear due to its shine progression basically being set in stone, as you need to fight Shadow Mario in every stage to unlock Corona Mountain, and if you only fight Shadow Mario in every stage, you will have just enough shines required to open Corona Mountain 50, meaning there's no real style choice while routing something like a glitchless any % run. Also, Corona Mountain sucks, but all of this is beyond the main point. The point is that if these two paragraphs were expanded, you could probably have a pretty convincing video. However, most of these points aren't that valid. Not because you might like one game more than the other, but because these arguments aren't actually saying that Game A is better than Game B. It's establishing that since Game A is good, and Game B is different in ways 1, 2, and 3, that means that Game B must be worse. It isn't actually establishing why Game A is good. It is simply establishing that because Game A is good, Game B is different and therefore bad. This is a common argument seen in, well, pretty much everything. There's this one long-ass video where a Sonic fan played through the entire 2D series of Mario platformers back-to-back, and he liked them more or less depending on how close they were to classic 2D Sonic. Sonic fans themselves love doing this between different Sonic games, and guess what? To you personally, it might genuinely also be this way. I'm no Sonic fan. I enjoyed most of my time with Adventure 2, minus the time I rage quit the game after Crazy Gadget made me just a tiny bit crazy, and I enjoyed the different stages, different characters, the variety, you know? And guess what, if I played a more modern Sonic game that is basically all Sonic, I'd probably dislike the lack of Sonic's stupid friends, as some internet reviews at the time put it, but like, the only other Sonic game I played was a bit of Adventure 06 and a full run of Shadow, so I don't really know. Look, the point is, even if you might not like a game because you prefer how a different game in the same series is more, that doesn't make that game better or worse, it just makes it different. Sometimes, of course, a game is genuinely worse, like the HD remasters of the GTA games, but you get my point. And there's this aspect which, well, it's more common than with just fanboys, but it's definitely prevalent in the entire gaming community. Our next point is that something being good doesn't mean that you have to like it, and something being bad doesn't mean you have to dislike it. And I'm not talking about ironically liking The Room, Sonic 06, Ancient Roman, Power of Darkside, that one's a real gem by the way, because what does it really mean for a game to be good or bad? Well, there's an objective quality thermometer, so it's nothing more or less than the common general opinion, and sometimes you can disagree with that opinion. I like a lot of pretty fucking mid Hot Wheels games, Turbo Racing, Velocity X, World Race, Stunt Track Challenge, and Beat That were a lot of the games I liked as a kid. They're still pretty fun, but they're really nothing special if you're not specifically a fan of the cool little Hot Wheels designs. They're no Burnout, or Gran Turismo, or Ridge Racer, better than Juiced, but they're still a ton of fun. Similarly, I have absolutely zero interest in many of the absolutely beloved modern PvP or competitive games because I simply don't care. Breath of the Wild is a Game of the Year game? Well, I don't really care. It took me until Echoes of Wisdom to try out one Zelda game, and that one was fun. Maybe I'll play another one at some point. Also, I can't get myself to care, like, at all about any indie horror game that isn't Voices of the Void. I also never cared for Undertale and the Deltarune chapters, or the other indie RPG Maker / RPG Maker RPGs at all. Why? I don't know, I think I just find them a little bit scrimbo-bimbo, you know? And for one, and I'm also kind of more interested in games with actual proper, you know, JRPG mechanics, you know, Xenoblade, whatever, way more than games that are kind of just walking sims with occasional quirky minigame-based combat. Look, generally, giving people a severe headache with my personal gaming tastes is not something that I'm after, but it can happen, and it's sometimes a sign of having a developed taste in games, even if that taste in games is a little bit unorthodox. Generally speaking, a lot of people's tastes in games aren't that developed, and the reason why is pretty damn complicated. Generally, people do not like to be challenged. Now, maybe you are an epic super turbo gamer who lives for the thrill of a hard or obtuse game, but I'm sure you'd be willing to admit that most people aren't built for that. Because of that, people like things that are familiar. Why do you think sequels sell so well? But there's more to it than just that. Humans are social creatures, well, most of the time. We like to feel accepted, and because of that, we, many times, will just adapt to the common opinion if we don't really know any better. I haven't seen the amazing Bulk personally, but I can assume from what I've heard that it's probably really shit. Similarly to that, many people will craft their opinions on games by listening to YouTubers, streamers, actual reviewers, and others. I don't know jack shit about fighting games, but I'll trust Punchy's review of strange Japanese fighting games to be accurate. I also trust when a professional TF2 player tells me the Pomson sucks, even if I basically never used it. But all of this can of course spiral. All of these takes are, to some degree, biased. Punchy may have said one of these games was only mid, when in fact it was actually solid, or maybe even awful. The Pomson might not be as bad as people claim it is if used correctly, but most likely it is just complete garbage. And this all can compound when watching video essays due to how they're presented. Like, even in this video, I have the freedom to construct it in any way that helps my arguments. Because of that, if I had enough reach and was a trusted reviewer, I could single-handedly spout some utter bullshit that could, in theory, change people's perception of an entire series. That's what happened with Steven Universe. One person, who had no idea what they're talking about, seriously impacted how people perceived an entire cartoon. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, what a transition, was a pretty solid little game on its own, but not Banjo 3, which to be fair the fans were promised. But Rare was sort of done with making those kinds of kiddie games at that point, and wanted to take the brand in a bit of a different direction. Most of the reviews the game got back during its release were pretty good, though some cited performance issues and the vehicle controls as other issues. But then the fans got to the games, and you may be wondering what problems they had. Well,
people like me are supposed to listen to people like you chatter on about this oppression in America. It doesn't exist.
Alright, I have no idea. In short, let's say the Banjo fans weren't too happy. I wonder how they feel about Bubsy 4D. Oh, right, speaking of Bubsy, that had a similar effect happen to it. It was a pretty game when it came out. Not a bad game, but like, very clearly not good either. But as Superman 64 was the worst Nintendo 64 game, the PS1 needed to have some kind of very obvious worst game mascot, where just looking at it you could immediately know it was bad. And because, sadly, nobody knew about the absolute irredeemable garbage cryo games, something like Ubik, Which, I mean, okay, you can really see this one is shit just by looking at it, but because Bubsy's art style was already somewhat psychedelic, and Bubsy himself had the idea of being a Scrimblow-Bimblow at the time, he was kind of sacrificed to be the mascot of bad PS1 games, even if it wasn't fully accurate at all. But opposite things can happen too. Games which had almost no relevance back in their day, like Pilotwings 64, which could mostly attribute their 1.1 million units sold to being the only other game next to Mario 64 during the console's release window in the US, its main sales market, and one of the 3 games that launched in Japan. This overall completely insignificant game is then turned into something that apparently revolutionized 3D gaming. Like, come on, it obviously did not. Nintendo will get their own section just a little bit later, don't you worry. In some aspects, the best way to fight against this kind of groupthink is to just be a contrarian, but excess contrarianism, especially when it's done performatively, can also just result in you purposefully being inflammatory and bad faith when talking about games, purely so you can have a different take on them and you just end up looking like an asshole. If you want a personal recommendation, always be skeptical of what people say about games, and do try to see if what they're saying is true or not, like a contrarian would, but don't go out of your way to be annoying on purpose or fight with random people online to debunk what they like. That's just not how it works. Yes, even with people who like 2600 games. Hey, so I've been told I should do this thing called a call to action. You see, I have this thing called a YouTube channel that you're watching this on, and clicking the little subscribe and the little like and the little bell and saying something funny down there would really help, because all the videos that have a lot of comments and likes have a lot of views. So if you have any funny questions, you can ask them down below at this point. Maybe at the end of the video, you can ask another question. The more the merrier. Also, if you want to watch all the really funny, weird stuff, you can set it to all, or if you only want to watch the stuff that YouTube thinks you want to watch, set it to personalized. Also, once I hit 10k, I'm gonna do another one of those stupid little videos, and another deranged top 10, so get ready for it. Anyways, bye. Now, let's get to Nintendo. This segment isn't entirely about Nintendo, though, as some of these patterns of behavior can also be seen in other types of fanboys as well, so keep that in mind as these ones are just particularly popular. Anyways, I'm aware Sonic fanboys get made fun of quite a lot, even today, but I think that if anything, Nintendo fanboys cause far more issues in the gaming landscape. This is partially because of Nintendo's history and reputation of generally not fucking up their game releases. At worst, the game was kinda mid, at least for the mainline stuff. So for start, let's talk about a very specific bias, the America bias. It's a topic I talked about before, so for brevity's sake, here's the TLDR. Nintendo hasn't been popular everywhere all the time. The one country where Nintendo has had consistent popularity was the US. After Atari crashed the American video game industry, Nintendo saw the opportunity to rebrand their Famicom as a toy and sell it overseas, and promise actual games with their seal of quality. That's how the story usually goes. But as you may be able to tell, this wasn't the case in other places. Japan had the Famicom, MSX, and other machines, while Europe had the BBC Micro, Commodore 64, Amiga, ZX Spectrum, Atari ST, and also I guess the Electronica BK0010 if you lived east of the Iron Curtain. In short, people were already spoiled for choice with both systems, and also games. Nintendo, to them, was just another console, and since it arrived a little bit late, it actually didn't do that well compared to the Master System, which came here earlier. Regardless of the fine details, you can see it's a pretty complicated, global thing. So, waiter, bring me a 2010s Nintendo YouTuber I can make fun of, please.
Nathaniel Bandy.
Great! An old Nathaniel Bandy video to pull funny bits from. Top 10 Mario games, brackets, old. Oh, this one's a great drinking game.
When the video game crash of 1983 happened, stores wouldn't stock video games anymore. Nintendo packaged this game and Rob with a Nintendo Entertainment System and marketed it as a toy. This toy revived video games.
Now, if this was about the US market specifically, he wouldn't be necessarily wrong, though he would just be kind of oversimplifying it.
And it's the reason we have Call of Duty, Halo, Sonic, you name it.
Okay, Bandy. Well, considering how Bandy feels about this video, wait, he made a new one? What does he say there? Well, there's no Mario 1 part, so I guess he did learn his lesson,
I mean, it's a fantastic game. It helps shape what 3D games are like today.
Right, we should probably talk about this. So I have danced around this for long enough. Most of the arguments around the NES and SNES have died down by this point in time. This is partially because the people who grew up with these systems are now too old to care. Nintendo 64 fanboys, not as much. Now, with the Nintendo 64 fans specifically, there are two varieties, which made it so that the system was far more popular than the amount of units it actually sold. So keep in mind, fan is good, fanboy is bad, okay? So it's important to note how badly the N64 flopped in Japan, being outsold by the Saturn, and it was pretty unpopular in most of Europe. But in America, it did really well. So well, in fact, that the PlayStation outsold it twice over. Of course, as you can imagine, the N64 had a mostly young audience, and it was probably not only the console for many American kids in the mid to late 90s, but also a hand-me-down for kids in the early 2000s because, believe it or not, before the internet, people did not only play the latest and greatest. You didn't even really know what was new unless you saw it in an ad, store, magazine, or your friend told you about it at school. This is where the internet sort of came in. So the Nintendo Wii sold over 100 million units, and it was in just so many households worldwide. And so on the Wii Shop channel, for quite attractive pricing, you had the Virtual Console. And you know what was on there? Well, the greatest hits, of course, just about 20-something games of the Nintendo 64 variety. From the ones that mattered, there were like, you know, Mario and Super Kart and Paperform, the Zeldas, F-Zero X and Star Fox 64, and some others. Generally speaking, the variety wasn't that great, but it had some of the classics like Mario 64, Paper Mario, and the Zeldas as the big main games in terms of scope and game length. And as the N64 was still sort of relevant in people's memories, it would appear in YouTube videos from time to time, including those greatest hits. And if you, a younger Wii owner, saw that on YouTube and wanted to play the classics, $10 was all it took. And also, I guess, a classic controller, but it was still a great price for those games at that specific point in time, so plenty of people were perfectly happy being first exposed to those games in that way. This is, yes, specifically why there seem to be a lot more Nintendo 64 fanboys compared to how well the console sold, but it is also important to note that emulation also played a huge part of it because the file size of Nintendo 64 cartridges is obviously far lower than of a full CD ISO, which also helped the N64 propagate long after it was dead. All of this had a cumulative effect on the general internet zeitgeist, especially in the US. YouTubers like the AVGN talked about the video game crash like it was a global event, and this sort of stuff just kind of spiraled and got accepted as a fact. In the end, once things are accepted as fact on the internet, it's very, very hard to change people's perception of that. Generally, Nintendo can seem to do no wrong, at least with what most people are concerned. The end point of this today is that Nintendo fanboys continuously enter conversations to valiantly defend their childhood console, or the console they were told was good by YouTubers twice their age, even if those conversations are actually full of people trying to have a real, actual discussion, though sometimes I might stoke the flames a little bit. This is very different to something like SEGA, where it really does feel like the vast majority of internet Sonic fans really seem to hate the new Sonic releases. Why is there a Psyduck on the screen? Oh, right, okay. You see, Sonic is not that popular. Frontiers only shipped like 4.5 million units, while Forces shipped 3.7 million. Granted, that's still a lot, but it's not a lot. On the other hand, Pokemon seems to ship a shitload of units every generation, yet if you go online, you'd assume the last good game was in the late 90s or early 2000s, depending of course on how many hairs the person saying that has on their neckbeard. This kind of fanboy has his own name in the Pokemon sphere. He's called a Gen 1er. This is a very interesting example because it's also partially what Sonic fanboys are to a degree. You see, most Sonic fanboys really hate the minor redesigns of Sonic's character, and similarly, these Pokemon quote-unquote fans despise any change whatsoever. There are a lot of people who are nostalgic, not really for the games themselves, but for how they felt when they played those games. The new games can never hit as good as the old ones, as they don't play the old Pokemon games because they enjoy the gameplay loop or story or whatever. They enjoy the games because they enjoy feeling how they felt back in the day when they played it. And there's a sad but also really funny DKC soundtrack comment that makes fun of this in a pretty funny way. I'm sorry. But that's kind of why these fanboys are allergic to change. And because Pokemon is just really popular, there's just a lot of these kinds of anti-modern fanboys, so keep that in mind. Though of course, you can see these Dimitri level takes in a lot of places, and the best counter to it is to, well, just point out the fallacy in their argument. I'll go back to have one more swing at Ninty in a moment, but let's go over some of the general fallacies a lot of these people commit. Now, there's a ton of these, and many of them can be applicable in many ways, but here are the biggest ones. Many times, there's this whole Mott and Bailey thing. This is a pretty basic one you may see often, starting with an indefensible inflammatory statement and then quickly backing down to one easy to defend and pretending it was the same argument from the beginning. A fanboy may say that the new game's just unplayable garbage, but once you actually ask them to back up their claims, they'll just say they lost their charm by being 3D or similar. Arguments by repetition or popularity are also widely used by fanboys. A lot of people say Mario 64 was the first 3D game, so it must be true. That doesn't actually defend the claim it's making, it's just saying that it's true because people think it's true, because there's no way so many people are wrong. No True Scotsman is one of my favorites because it kinda did happen recently. Now, I do shower regularly, sometimes multiple times per day. However, I also like entering stupid internet arguments from time to time. It's a thing you can do if you're not a epic big YouTuber, because those guys act like it's above them and argue under an oath then. So, I had a guy recently saying that Mario 64 was the first 3D game, unironically, and I decided to kind of strawman his arguments as a joke. And then he agreed that that was what he actually believed, and that I just clarified his statements. So, let's go through them. By his logic, Mario 64 was the first 3D game, because in order to be a 3D game, his requirements were that 1. You control a human. 2. You use polygons. 3. You control the camera as a separate entity in the 3D space. And 4, you control the character without tank controls. Now, all of these arguments are an appeal to purity. The idea is to make a generalization true by changing the generalization so it can exclude any counterexample that I make. No true 3D game has tank controls, no true 3D game has a fixed camera, etc. All of that so he could exclude games like Tomb Raider, or Quake, or Ridge Racer, Resident Evil, Jumping Flash, or other games from being real 3D games. Why? I don't know. There's also a ton of thought-terminating cliches that stem from this. Quality over quantity is often used as an argument against the PS1 having real games, even though, like it clearly did. I listed over 400 great, good, and solid games at one point, and there was still way more I could have chosen, but my scope was just kinda limited. And that list actually got the guy who I was responding to change his mind, but oh well. Appeal to motif is also a pretty funny one. He's a hater! Is the simplest rebuttal that you can make, and it can take any actual criticism you make of something you may even like and turn you into the enemy. You must be wrong because you're just a hater. Skitty Bitty had people write off their well-made video essay because they just assumed it was all a giant smear campaign against a very successful game that might not be as perfect as people think it is. Now, there's a casual oversimplification fallacy that some Nintendo fanboys often commit, and this is a big one, so let's go back to kneecapping, okay? The appeal to authority fallacy is commonly used by Nintendo fanboys to claim their games influenced most of the industry. This is because for ages Nintendo had just refused to recognize most games that weren't theirs or on their systems. Let's look at Ocarina of Time. This is a game that was in many ways referenced by many other games. But Ocarina of Time was not made in a vacuum now, was it? Well, the story Nintendo would like you to believe is that it was. But no, it was surrounded by a sea of other games. In fact, there's one particular game that I think it's pretty clear it lifted some ideas from, Tomb Raider. This game was genuinely insane for 1996. It was way more difficult and complicated than something like Mario 64, which is why it's now harder for so many people to go back to if they didn't play it back then, but in so many ways, this game was well ahead of its time. So what did Zelda rip from it? Well, quite a few things. For one, the context-sensitive buttons that people praised Zelda for had already existed in Tomb Raider, specifically Link's movement, dodging and such. It's quite similar to how it worked in Tomb Raider in many ways. The aiming was also like a semi-manual version of the already present systems in Tomb Raider. Lara automatically locks onto the nearest enemy while in fight mode, similarly how you'd hit Z to lock onto the nearest enemy in Zelda. It's just that due to the different combat styles in Tomb Raider, you would hold X to shoot, then release it and press it again in order to retarget the nearest enemy, while in Zelda you would release Z and hold it again to switch. The camera is also somewhat similar to Tomb Raider's, where there's a specific button you hit to look around. It's L1 in Tomb Raider, while in Ocarina of Time it's C up. Look, maybe these aren't the best arguments that I could make if I want to say that one game was inspired by the other. Though, when compared to the claims that Mario 64 was why we have 3D games today, it honestly looks downright fair. And you know, I personally believe it, because it's pretty hard to have a concrete answer on what specific things influence game designers. Even game designers themselves aren't the best sources for this information, as, and you won't believe this, they play tons of video games, and sometimes it's hard to place down which specific idea you got from where, so often you just name one or two big influences. Most of my RPG ideas I would say come from something like Panzer Dragoon Saga or Final Fantasy, specifically the battle systems and world design. However, honestly, there are probably way more games I pull my ideas from that I'm not even aware I'm pulling from. Similarly, the world of video games is so vast and varied, and game designers got to where they are by enjoying video games, meaning their inspirations are probably a huge mix of different games and genres. Maybe you could argue Zelda lifted those ideas from a completely different game. Maybe the Water Temple copied the system, considering both of them sorta suck. I mean, the Water Temple already sort of existed in A Link to the Past with sorta similar mechanics, but maybe these things just work a little bit differently in 3D compared to 2D, you know? Especially with the mazy design. And all of these examples that show the correlations between Zelda and Tomb Raider are just conjecture. I have no hard evidence to support anything I've said here. And you see, this is what fanboys often do. Instead of evidence, I am just doing guesswork based off of the reasonable assumptions that I can make about the influences these games had. Ocarina of Time really was in development until 1998, giving it more than enough time to lift influences from Tomb Raider 1 and maybe even 2. Tomb Raider was huge, so that definitely means they at least played a bit of it when compared to something small like Jumping Flash, so honestly, it would make sense that Nintendo would be inspired by Tomb Raider. Though honestly, some of those floating stages from Mario 64 do remind me a little bit of Jumping Flash's more nonsensical stages, but no, I am not giving into even more conjecture. There's no way. The real problem with this type of thinking is that you're basically just piling guesswork on top of more guesswork, until you use your previous guesswork as evidence that your new guesswork might be sort of accurate. Kind of like with FNAF lore. And by this point, we're kind of at the end, aren't we? A little bit abruptly, but that's it. Those are most of the things that fanboys do. Of course, there's a lot more fanboy stuff to be looked over, but of course my reach is limited, and I'd much rather give you some generic or creative examples to show you how to detect them and how to deal with them, rather than just pointing and laughing at random weird Nintendo fanboys and their shit takes. I mean, it would be fun to a degree, but at some point there's no real reason to be honestly kinda hyper-negative about stuff like Mario 64, just to drive the point home that it wasn't as perfect as people like to pretend it was, and because, you know, well, other people existed at the time or whatever, but like, man, not only do other people not care enough, I don't care enough either. Also, the glazing just has to stop, like, seriously, man. And generally, especially when it's like really small, like random people who have takes, I don't know, I don't think it's fair to really put them on blast unless they're like kind of a big YouTuber. But if they're kind of a big YouTuber, then again, if you put them on blast as a smaller one, you're kinda gonna be teared apart by the fanboys of the YouTuber. So you're kinda damned if you make fun of somebody more popular, and damned if you make fun of a random, so I'm not going to do it. Anyways, yeah, bye.